It was April 1945. The war was ending, but Germany looked like a graveyard of empires. American trucks rolled through streets that had once echoed with Nazi parades, now reduced to dust and whispers. In the small towns of Bavaria and Hesse, the air hung thick with smoke and disbelief. Old men stared from shattered doorways. Women clutched their children, their faces pale with exhaustion and quiet fear. They had been told the Americans were monsters. Instead, they saw boys, tall, clean-shaven, chewing gum, smiling under steel helmets. The GIs moved with a strange ease. They carried radios that played jazz. Their uniforms were new, their pockets full of cigarettes, chocolate, and photographs from home. Each soldier looked like he had stepped out of another world, a world untouched by rubble, by rationing, by propaganda. For the first time, ordinary Germans saw what freedom looked like. And for the first time, American soldiers walked through a land that had once sworn to destroy them, not as conquerors, but as living proof of another kind of power. The power of prosperity, the power of choice, the power to rebuild. By the spring of 1945, Germany was collapsing under the weight of its own war. Its cities were gutted by Allied bombing raids. Bridges lay in rivers, railways torn apart, and roads choked with refugees fleeing from the east. The Reich that had promised 1,000 years was ending in a few last desperate weeks. Everywhere, the signs of surrender were already written in silence. The front lines had shattered. German officers burned documents in basements. Civilians no longer spoke of victory, only of survival. In Berlin, the radio still declared loyalty to the Führer, but the countryside no longer believed. Into this desolation rolled the American army. Young, confident, organized, and overwhelmingly well-equipped. Their convoys stretched for miles, jeeps and tanks glinting in the pale spring light. To the locals watching from behind half-ruined walls, the sight was almost unreal. For years they had seen only hunger and scarcity. Now came soldiers whose uniforms were pressed, whose belts shone, whose laughter sounded like a foreign language. Most of these GIs were barely in their 20s. They had grown up in a different world. A world of abundance, movies, jazz, and pocket money. They came from small towns in Iowa, Pennsylvania, Texas, carrying with them a sense of normalcy that Germany had lost long ago. They had fought across North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, and the Ardennes, and now, finally, they were inside the Reich itself. To the Germans, it was like watching ghosts from a parallel civilization. The Americans had trucks filled with supplies, crates of food, chocolate bars, cigarettes, nylon stockings, chewing gum. Each item, simple as it was, carried the scent of an unimaginable luxury. Many Germans had never seen such things since the 1930s. Under Nazi rule, the economy had been consumed by war. By 1945, most families survived on watery soups and black bread made from ersatz flour. Coal was scarce, soap almost mythical. A working radio was a treasure. And then, one afternoon, an American private tossed a chocolate bar to a hungry child. And that small gesture would echo louder than any artillery barrage. Because what entered Germany that month was not just an army. It was an idea. The idea that life could be different. The GIs did not march with the iron discipline of the Wehrmacht. They joked, whistled, and leaned from their trucks, waving to curious villagers. They took photographs, shared rations, and, in some cases, helped rebuild what their bombs had destroyed. For Germans raised on years of fear, uniformed men who smiled were an unfamiliar sight. Behind this apparent ease, however, stood a formidable machine. The U.S. Army of 1945 was the most technologically advanced and logistically capable force the world had ever seen. Its soldiers were supplied with endless fuel, food, and equipment. Every division moved like a self-contained city, with kitchens, mechanics, medics, and chaplains. To the weary population of a ruined continent, the Americans seemed to possess bottomless resources and an equally endless confidence. But that confidence was born of sacrifice. More than 400,000 Americans had already died in Europe and the Pacific. Those who now entered Germany had seen the worst of the war: the hedgerows of Normandy, the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the mud of the Rhine. They were not naive. Yet they carried themselves differently from other occupiers in history. Not with arrogance, but with a strange, almost casual certainty that their way of life would endure. For the Germans, the contrast was unbearable and magnetic. Their empire was in ruins, their ideology exposed as madness. And yet these foreigners, these men who ate from tin cans and played harmonicas, carried an ease that no propaganda could imitate. In the rubble of 1945, a collision of worlds was about to take place. The disciplined, broken society of the Third Reich would meet the freewheeling, optimistic spirit of America. And in that meeting, Germany would see its own future. Not through politics or treaties, but through the simple act of watching how these soldiers lived. The war was ending, but a new occupation and a new kind of transformation was only beginning. For 12 years, the German people had lived inside a closed universe. Every thought, every radio broadcast, every poster had carried the same message: Germany is strong. The Führer is infallible. The Reich is eternal. Now, in the spring of 1945, that world was collapsing, not just in ruins of concrete, but in the minds of millions. When the first Americans entered towns like Aachen, Würzburg, and Nuremberg, the streets were lined with civilians who didn't know how to behave. Some saluted nervously, others hid indoors. A few raised white flags made from tablecloths. Children stood barefoot in the rubble, their eyes following the columns of jeeps. The soldiers who stepped out of those jeeps were unlike any Germans had seen before. They carried themselves with casual authority, sleeves rolled, cigarettes dangling, helmets tilted back. They laughed easily, even after years of war. They looked healthy, well-fed, and confident, like men who came from a place untouched by destruction. And in truth, they did. The United States of America, by 1945, stood at the height of its industrial power. Its factories had never been bombed. Its farms produced more food than any army could eat. While Europe starved, America was sending ships packed with tanks, rations, and gasoline across the Atlantic every single day. For Germans, this abundance was incomprehensible. They had been told that the Anglo-Americans were decadent, weak, ruled by Jewish bankers and moral decay. But the reality standing before them was different. Disciplined soldiers driving vehicles that never broke down, carrying food that never spoiled, speaking freely without fear of secret police. The difference wasn't just material, it was psychological. The Americans acted as if they owned their own fate. They questioned orders. They joked with officers. They seemed to live by an invisible code, a belief that no uniform, no government, no ideology could own their conscience. For a population raised under total obedience, this freedom was both shocking and magnetic. When German civilians entered American field kitchens or watched soldiers distribute food, they witnessed a civilization that valued abundance as a human right, not as a privilege of conquest. American soldiers shared rations with starving families, gave away cigarettes, and traded soap for keepsakes. To a woman who hadn't seen real coffee in years, the smell alone could bring tears. To a boy who tasted his first Hershey bar, it felt like tasting another planet. Behind every exchange lay an unspoken question. How could a nation so rich, so free, so self-assured exist while their own world had turned to ash? The contrast was brutal. Nazi propaganda had promised superiority, yet it was the Americans who embodied modernity. They had better clothes, better machines, better music. They listened to swing and blues, wore wristwatches and sunglasses, and spoke of places like New York or Chicago as casually as Germans once spoke of the fatherland. To many Germans, these men represented not humiliation, but possibility. Some saw in them the chance to escape the shadows of dictatorship and scarcity. Others felt shame, a deep, gnawing realization that the system they had believed in had robbed them not only of victory, but of dignity. And for the Americans, too, the experience was transformative. Many had grown up hearing about the Old World, a place of culture and order. But what they found were burned cities, homeless families, and silent crowds watching their convoys pass. The myth of European grandeur had turned to rubble. In its place stood a new truth. America had become the symbol of the future. That future, however, was fragile. Beneath the surface of smiles and handshakes, tensions simmered. The U.S. Army had strict rules against fraternization, fearing moral compromise or intelligence leaks. But human nature was stronger than regulations. Wherever the GIs stayed, in inns, farmhouses, or requisitioned homes, the line between victor and vanquished began to blur. In those first days of occupation, every shared cigarette, every borrowed record, every whispered conversation was a step across the wreckage of ideology. The war had ended, but the meeting between these two worlds, one defeated, one triumphant, was just beginning to define the peace. And in that fragile peace, something extraordinary was about to unfold. A cultural collision that would reshape not only Germany's recovery, but the moral landscape of post-war Europe. The next chapter of this story begins where the guns fell silent, and the human eyes finally met without fear. 1. The human angle. First encounters, in the first days after surrender, every meeting between an American GI and a German civilian carried the tension of history. Both sides stared at each other across the ruins, one as conqueror, the other as survivor. And yet, within those silent exchanges, something deeply human began to surface. In towns like Aschaffenburg and Bamberg, American soldiers entered homes not to loot, but to search for weapons or Nazi flags. Often they found families huddled in basements, exhausted, terrified, clutching photographs of sons lost on the Eastern Front. Some soldiers offered food. Others simply nodded and left, not knowing what else to do. For the German civilians, it was the first time in years they had seen soldiers who were not shouting orders, who did not demand loyalty to a regime. The Americans were polite, sometimes awkward, sometimes kind. Their authority came not from fear, but from a quiet sense of purpose. Many GIs had grown up in working-class neighborhoods. They knew hardship, but not hopelessness. When they looked at the faces of German families, they didn't see enemies. They saw people trying to survive, much like their own back home. The war had stripped away ideology. What remained was the raw simplicity of human contact. One U.S. sergeant wrote in his diary, "We expected fanatics. Instead, we found mothers and children. They look at us like we're from another planet." And to the Germans, they were. The GIs represented a world where food was plentiful, where electricity worked, where the government did not vanish overnight. In that realization lay both envy and hope, emotions that would quietly drive the rebirth of a nation. The cultural angle, the shock of abundance. When American convoys arrived, they brought with them a sensory storm of foreign sounds and smells. Diesel mixed with the sweet scent of chocolate. Music drifted from portable radios. Benny Goodman, Glenn Miller, Billie Holiday, filling streets that had forgotten what joy sounded like. For Germans raised on the martial rhythm of Nazi marches, swing music was disorienting. It was rebellious, improvisational, alive. Everything their regimented world had suppressed. Soon, local children gathered around trucks to listen, tapping their feet. The GIs gave out Wrigley's gum, canned peaches, and lucky strikes. Small things, yet they carried a psychological weight far beyond their material value. To touch these items was to touch modernity itself. German women began using empty K-ration tins as makeshift cooking pots. Nylon stockings and soap became currency in a silent, informal market. For the first time, the word America no longer meant propaganda. It meant possibility. To the soldiers, it was simply their way of life. They didn't understand how surreal it looked to the defeated population. They played baseball in fields where Luftwaffe planes had once been parked. They organized movie nights, projecting Hollywood films onto the walls of ruined cinemas. And through those simple, unplanned gestures, they introduced something that Germany hadn't felt in years: normalcy. Not victory, not ideology, but the rhythm of ordinary life. Laughter, music, and motion without fear. The Germans watched with quiet fascination. The Americans didn't bow to officers. They joked openly. They disagreed. They were part of a structure, but not enslaved by it. And in those small freedoms, Germans began to see a different kind of strength. The kind that comes not from obedience, but from self-belief. The gender and social angle, between survival and morality nowhere, were these contrasts more complex than in the encounters between German women and American soldiers. The war had left millions of men dead or imprisoned. Entire towns were populated mostly by women, children, and the elderly. When the GIs arrived, relationships, both fleeting and lasting, began almost immediately. Some were born from kindness, others from necessity. Chocolate, cigarettes, or a can of corned beef could mean a meal for a starving family. The U.S. military forbade fraternization. Officially, there was to be no mingling with the enemy. But hunger and loneliness are stronger than orders. In the shadows of destroyed cathedrals and empty cafes, human needs quietly defied military discipline. Many Germans judged these women harshly. They were called Ami girls, accused of betrayal. But behind every whispered insult was a deeper truth. For many, survival required compromise. To have access to food, safety, or protection was to make impossible choices. For the American soldiers, too, the situation was morally tangled. Some fell in love. Others exploited the imbalance of power. Most, however, simply sought a sense of connection in a world that had lost all innocence. Letters home reveal a striking tone of confusion and empathy. One private wrote, "They're not like what we were told. These girls are just trying to live. They smile, but behind it, you can see they've lost everything." These encounters would later influence Germany's social transformation, challenging old hierarchies, moral codes, and even ideas of gender. Through the blurred line between compassion and survival, post-war Germany began to rediscover the humanity that totalitarianism had erased. And as these human, cultural, and emotional layers deepened, another set of forces began to emerge. Less visible, but equally powerful. The psychological and political transformations that would define the shape of occupied Germany. The psychological angle. Guilt, envy, and curiosity. In 1945, the German mind was a landscape of ruins as vast as the cities themselves. Defeat had come not just militarily, but morally. The truth of the concentration camps was beginning to surface, and for many, silence was the only way to endure. When American soldiers entered those same towns, they didn't just bring rations and music, they brought mirrors. Every interaction forced Germans to confront who they had been, what they had believed, and what that belief had destroyed. Some civilians looked at the GIs with quiet resentment. They saw in them the victor's confidence, the easy laughter of men who had not seen their homes burned. Others felt shame, unable to meet their eyes. But beneath both emotions lay a deeper current: curiosity. Who were these men who smiled even after years of fighting? Why did they speak freely, question authority, or laugh in uniform? To a people conditioned to obedience, this confidence seemed almost reckless. Yet it also carried a strange magnetism, a sense that freedom was not chaos, but strength. Psychologists in the occupation forces noted the same phenomenon repeatedly. Defeated populations often measured themselves against the victors. But in Germany's case, the gap was not just military, it was cultural, moral, and spiritual. In the faces of the Americans, Germans saw not just power, but peace. The war had not corrupted them. It had, in some ways, clarified them. And that realization began to plant a quiet, enduring seed, the desire to become like them, not through submission, but through transformation. It was this psychological shift, invisible yet unstoppable, that would make post-war Germany fertile ground for democracy. The political angle, a different kind of occupation. The American occupation that began in 1945 was unlike any the world had seen. Traditional conquerors sought tribute and obedience. The Americans, by contrast, sought reconstruction and re-education. At first, it was strict. Every public building flew the stars and stripes. Nazi symbols were torn down, books burned, and party members interrogated. But beneath the rigidity of denazification was a revolutionary approach. To build democracy not through punishment, but through example. American officers reopened schools and replaced propaganda with civics. Newspapers were encouraged to print freely, within reason. Local elections were reintroduced. And everywhere the underlying message was the same. Freedom is not a reward. It is a responsibility. This was a political experiment as much as an occupation. Germany would not simply be subdued, it would be remade. Contrast this with the Soviet zone to the east, where factories were dismantled and shipped to Moscow, and dissent was silenced by force. In the American zone, jazz clubs reopened, libraries filled with translated novels, and universities began teaching philosophy again. Freedom, cautiously, imperfectly, returned. To many Germans, it was bewildering. The men who had once bombed their cities now helped rebuild them. The army that had defeated their sons was now feeding their children. It was not mercy alone that shocked them. It was the absence of vengeance. This approach reflected a deeper American belief that the surest path to security was not domination, but conversion, not by faith, but by culture. And so, without speeches or manifestos, the U.S. military became a silent teacher of democracy. Every jeep, every ration pack, every fair-minded decision by an officer told the same story. Authority could exist without terror. Power could serve without cruelty. And in that lesson lay the foundation for a new Germany. 6. The symbolic angle. Coca-Cola and the ruins, every occupation has its symbols. In the American zones of Germany, they weren't flags or monuments. They were ordinary objects, a bottle of Coca-Cola, a pack of Lucky Strikes, a record of Louis Armstrong. To the Germans, these items were talismans of a foreign reality. Coca-Cola, once banned as a product of capitalist decadence, now became a token of freedom. Its sweetness, its sparkle, its foreignness, everything about it spoke of a world that still believed in joy. Photographs from 1945 showed German children sitting on tank hulls drinking cola, or smiling as soldiers hand out gum. These images, innocent on the surface, carried enormous symbolic weight. They marked the end of fear and the beginning of fascination. Soon, black markets flourished, not for weapons, but for jeans, cigarettes, chocolate, and soap. German teenagers, newly unburdened by Nazi discipline, began imitating the style of their liberators. They called themselves Ami-fans. They listened to jazz and swing, tried English phrases, and dreamed of places like California and New York, which they knew only from stories. What began as curiosity would evolve into cultural alignment. In the ruins of defeat, Germany began to rebuild itself in the image of its conqueror. But this time, conquest was not enforced. It was invited. The Coca-Cola bottle became a relic of modern hope. The Jeep became a symbol of mobility and independence. And the GI, the young, confident, democratic soldier, became a mythic figure of freedom itself. This was the true quiet revolution of 1945. A cultural empire rising not through fear, but through fascination, as one German newspaper wrote in 1946. We lost the war, but we have discovered the Americans. And perhaps, in doing so, we have found the future. That future, however, would not arrive gently. Beneath the music and laughter, a deeper struggle was forming. How to turn ruin into rebirth, guilt into purpose, and occupation into partnership. It was in those uneasy months of transition that the story reached its turning point, when the relationship between conqueror and conquered began to change forever. By the summer of 1945, Germany was no longer a battlefield, it was a vast experiment in rebirth. The fighting had stopped, but the silence that followed was almost heavier than the war itself. Across shattered towns, church bells began to ring again for the first time in years. And alongside those sounds came the rumble of engines, American supply trucks moving not toward conquest, but toward reconstruction. For the German people, this was the true moment of awakening. They had lost everything, their cities, their pride, their certainty, yet they had survived. Now they faced a new kind of invasion, one of help, structure, and unexpected generosity. The U.S. military government, headquartered in Frankfurt, began issuing directives that no conqueror in history had ever attempted. Schools were ordered to reopen. Newspapers were authorized to print again, but without Nazi ideology. Libraries purged of propaganda were restocked with Western classics. Former soldiers were retrained as police officers under democratic law. Each step was small, yet together they created the feeling that life, real life, was returning. To the Americans, this was not charity. It was policy. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, now overseeing the occupation, understood that peace would not come through punishment alone. In his reports to Washington, he argued that Germany must not be left to despair, or it would fall into chaos, and perhaps into Soviet hands. The goal was not vengeance, but stability. In the beginning, the relationship was uneasy. Germans feared that every kindness hid control. Americans feared that every smile hid resentment. But slowly, through shared labor and shared hunger, the barriers began to fall. In places like Stuttgart and Munich, local civilians began assisting U.S. engineers in clearing roads, repairing bridges, and rebuilding water systems. American officers invited German mayors to meetings, an act unthinkable only months earlier. Children learned English songs in school, while soldiers learned simple German phrases to trade, talk, or just connect. A kind of fragile trust began to form, not through speeches, but through sweat. One American officer wrote, "We came to occupy. Instead, we began to rebuild. And somewhere along the way, we stopped thinking of them as enemies." For German civilians, the first signs of recovery were small but profound. Electricity flickered back in city centers. Shops reopened, selling salvaged goods. Trains began to run again, carrying passengers instead of troops. And through it all, the Americans were present, not as rulers, but as enablers. They brought tools, medical aid, even paper and pencils for schools. They enforced order, but not oppression. Their soldiers patrolled streets not to intimidate, but to protect. The most striking symbol of this transformation was food. In 1945, starvation loomed across Germany. The average German survived on 1,000 calories a day, half the minimum for survival. The American army, aware of the danger, began distributing surplus rations to civilians. For the first time since the war began, people ate without fear. In kitchens across the American zone, GIs shared their rations, eggs, canned meat, powdered milk, with families who had once been taught to hate them. The gesture carried a moral power no speech could match. Feeding the defeated was not just an act of mercy, it was the beginning of reconciliation. Soon, this relationship grew beyond necessity. Local Germans began to admire the Americans' energy and pragmatism. To them, the GIs seemed to live without bitterness, without fear of authority, without shame and optimism. Even in the ruins, they smiled. They built. They believed. That belief was contagious. In towns like Heidelberg, the Americans encouraged the creation of local councils, run by civilians rather than military officers. German teachers were reinstated, provided they had no Nazi ties. Churches reopened and began preaching not vengeance, but forgiveness. Step by step, Germany began to breathe again. Of course, not everyone welcomed the change. Some Germans resented the Americans' moral authority, calling them hypocrites who had bombed their cities and now preached peace. Some GIs abused their power, looting or exploiting civilians. But even with these dark corners, the overall story was undeniable. The conquerors were turning into partners. The American zone became a living classroom of democracy. Messy, improvised, but genuine. Each rebuilt bridge, each reopened school, each handshake between an officer and a mayor became part of a quiet revolution. And beneath that revolution, another force was rising. One that would soon reach far beyond rebuilding or rations. It was the force of culture, of imagination, of identity itself. Germany was no longer looking east toward the ruins of empire. It was looking west, toward the light of a new world. And in that turning gaze lay the true climax of this story, when the occupied began to see their occupiers not as victors, but as mirrors of the life they wished to live. By late 1946, the shock of defeat had begun to fade, replaced by something far more complex: admiration. The American occupation was no longer seen merely as foreign control. It had become a window into a new kind of civilization. Everywhere, traces of the old Germany still lingered. Swastikas carved into walls, slogans half erased by weather, but over them rose new symbols: movie posters, jazz bands, open-air markets. The soundtrack of post-war recovery was no longer the march of boots, but the hum of engines, the crackle of radios, and the laughter of children chasing American trucks for candy. This was the birth of Americanization, not through decree, but through desire. In Frankfurt, German youth crowded into makeshift cinemas to watch films starring Humphrey Bogart and Rita Hayworth. For many, it was their first glimpse of a world without uniforms, a world of freedom, humor, and romance. Hollywood became the new mythology. It replaced the false heroism of the Reich with the subtle heroism of individual choice. In cafes, young Germans traded loaves of bread for chewing gum or Lucky Strikes. Some cut out American magazine photos to decorate walls. Chrome cars, smiling families, city skylines shimmering in sunlight. The future had a shape again, and it looked unmistakably American. But beneath the glamour lay real transformation. American occupation authorities began encouraging local self-governance, free trade unions, and independent press. They reopened universities and reintroduced philosophy and political science, subjects once deemed dangerous by the Nazis. Intellectuals who had survived the war began to speak again, and they spoke of freedom, human rights, and individual dignity. For ordinary Germans, these words were strange, even uncomfortable. Freedom, after all, meant responsibility. The freedom to fail as much as to succeed. But slowly, through experience rather than ideology, they began to understand it. The most visible change came in the economy. American logistical efficiency, the ability to rebuild railways, repair supply chains, and restart factories astonished the locals. German engineers, disciplined and precise, began collaborating with American officers who thought in broader, bolder terms. Together, they restored power grids, reopened steelworks, and restarted the flow of coal, the bloodstream of modern civilization. Soon, the phrase "made in Germany," once a mark of militarism, began to regain its older meaning: craftsmanship, quality, reliability. It was the first sign that Germany could be reborn not as a destroyer, but as a builder. The Americans understood the importance of pride. They did not demand humiliation, they demanded progress. General Lucius D. Clay, the U.S. military governor, summed it up in a memo to Washington. "A hungry man cannot be taught democracy. He must first be fed." So they fed, not just with food but with opportunity. They encouraged entrepreneurship, allowed small businesses to reopen, and provided loans to restart production. This pragmatic compassion planted the roots of what would later become known as the German economic miracle. But the transformation wasn't purely economic. Culturally, Germany was shifting from obedience to expression. Music clubs reopened under American oversight, soon filled with jazz, blues, and swing. Teenagers began copying the slang and style of the GIs. In 1947, newspapers reported the emergence of a new subculture: the swing youth, defiant in spirit, dressed in second-hand American uniforms, dancing to forbidden rhythms. It was a quiet rebellion against the past, against fear, against silence. Through rhythm and laughter, they were reclaiming what the Reich had stolen: joy. Even the churches began to change tone. Pastors who had once preached national duty now spoke of forgiveness, reconciliation, and universal dignity. American chaplains often shared pulpits with them, reading from the same Bible, but with different words. Not about vengeance, but about mercy. And in this moral reshaping, the seeds of democracy found their soil. The Americans also introduced a concept entirely foreign to Germans: open criticism of authority. Town hall meetings allowed citizens to question officials publicly. Newspapers ran editorials debating local governance. The simple act of disagreement, once a death sentence under the Gestapo, became an act of citizenship. To the GIs, it was routine. To the Germans, it was revolutionary. One German journalist later wrote, "The Americans taught us something the Nazis never could: that the truth need not fear the light." By 1947, the transformation was visible to the world. Former enemies now worked side by side. Children learned English in classrooms decorated with both the German and American flags. And in the evenings, as radios played swing tunes across the valleys of Bavaria and the Rhineland, the impossible seemed to have happened. Two nations had begun to share not just a peace, but a purpose. Yet behind this progress lay an unresolved question. Could Germany truly reinvent itself, or was it simply borrowing the identity of its conqueror? The answer would come not from words, but from action. In the years that followed, when rubble would give way to steel, and despair would harden into determination. For now, though, amid the ruins and ration cards, the most unlikely friendship in modern history had begun. A friendship born from the ashes of war, built on respect, pragmatism, and the quiet understanding that freedom, once seen, could never again be unseen. By 1948, Germany was no longer just a defeated nation. It was a laboratory for the modern world. Every decision taken in the American zone carried consequences that stretched far beyond its borders. The rubble that had once symbolized destruction now became the raw material for a new civilization. Factories that had been silent since 1945 began to hum again. Electricity returned to cities. Trains, long derailed, started running between Frankfurt, Stuttgart, and Munich. The black market, once the only economy left, began to shrink as real wages reappeared. And with each paycheck, the German people felt a flicker of dignity returning. The Americans had learned a lesson from the end of World War I that humiliation breeds vengeance. This time, they built not a punishment, but a partnership. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, became the cornerstone of that partnership. Billions of dollars in aid flowed into Western Europe, and Germany received a significant share. But it wasn't just the money. It was the method. Funds came with expectations, efficiency, accountability, and transparency. German administrators, now working under American guidance, implemented systems that rewarded productivity instead of privilege. The results were almost immediate. Food supplies stabilized, and rationing began to ease. Shops reopened, stocked with goods not seen for years. Flour, shoes, radios, even bicycles. Children born in the shadow of bombed-out cities grew up watching those same cities come back to life. The Germans called it Wiederaufbau, rebuilding. But it was more than architecture. It was identity reconstruction. American cultural centers opened in nearly every major city. Libraries were filled with translated works of Mark Twain, Steinbeck, and Hemingway. Lectures on democracy, journalism, and civic rights drew packed audiences. To a people long conditioned to obey, these were revelations. For the GIs who stayed behind as occupation administrators, the experience was equally transformative. They had arrived expecting hostility. Instead, they found gratitude. Cautious at first, then sincere. Friendships formed. Some soldiers even married local women, bridging the divide that propaganda had once made seem eternal. But not everything was simple. Memories of the war still lingered in every family, every street. Some Germans felt shame, others resentment. And for the survivors of Nazi terror, the Jews, the political prisoners, the displaced, the sight of Germans rebuilding so quickly was both miraculous and painful. How could a nation heal without truly facing its crimes? The Americans understood this dilemma. They enforced the denazification process, removing former Nazi officials from office, banning symbols of the regime, and conducting war crimes trials. Yet over time, this rigid policy softened. Practicality demanded reconciliation. Skilled engineers, teachers, and administrators were needed to rebuild. And many of them had once been part of the machine they were now helping to undo. It was a moral tightrope. Rebuild without forgetting. Forgive without erasing. And in this balance, the new Germany took shape. Neither innocent nor condemned, but responsible. In Washington, some questioned the generosity. Why rebuild an enemy so soon after victory? But the architects of policy, men like George Marshall and Lucius D. Clay, saw farther ahead. A stable, prosperous Germany would be a bulwark against future tyranny, whether from within or from beyond the Iron Curtain rising in the east. And so, the aid continued, accompanied by quiet faith. In the markets of Cologne, shopkeepers began displaying signs in English. "Welcome, GI." Bars played American swing tunes, and young Germans practiced the slang they heard from soldiers. A decade earlier, those same towns had shouted, "Heil Hitler." Now they laughed over coffee and cigarettes with the very men who had ended that world. The contrast was staggering, but it was real. And it was working. The American experiment in Reconstruction was achieving something no occupation in history had. Transformation through partnership. Not domination. The GIs had brought more than guns and supplies. They had brought a mirror, showing Germany not what it was, but what it could become. And in that reflection, a nation once built on obedience began learning the difficult, beautiful art of freedom. By 1949, Germany was no longer a territory under occupation. It was becoming a partner in rebuilding Europe. In May of that year, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, was officially founded in Bonn, under the guidance of Allied oversight. and with the moral architecture shaped by American ideals. Its first chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, stood before the ruins of the old Reich and promised a future based not on fear, but on faith. Faith in democracy, in industry, and in the ordinary citizen's power to shape destiny. The Americans watched as this new republic took its first uncertain steps, much like a recovering patient learning to walk again after years in darkness. What made this rebirth remarkable was its tone. There were no parades, no triumphal speeches, no illusion of glory. Germany had learned humility, and from that humility came strength. The U.S. continued to guide, but now as an ally rather than a master. Advisors helped draft economic policies, legal frameworks, and constitutional principles. The new Grundgesetz, the basic law, enshrined freedoms Germany had never truly possessed before. Free press, independent courts, equal rights for women, protection from arbitrary authority. For many Germans, these weren't abstract ideals. They were acts of moral resurrection. American influence reached deep into daily life. Television, once a wartime curiosity, now became a window to the modern world. Cars filled the streets again. First Jeeps, then Volkswagens. Supermarkets replaced ration lines. Jazz and early rock and roll spread through cafes and school dances. A generation that had grown up amid rubble now wore denim, carried transistor radios, and dreamed of peace instead of conquest. This cultural transformation did not erase memory. It transformed it. The past was still there, in the silent scars of bombed churches and in the photographs hidden in drawers. But the new Germany chose to face it through remembrance, not denial. Monuments began to appear, not to victory, but to loss. The world had rarely seen such quiet honesty from a nation once known for its pride. As prosperity returned, so did political confidence. With American encouragement, West Germany joined the European coal and steel community, a humble economic agreement that would later evolve into the European Union. The idea was simple but revolutionary: bind nations together through trade, so deeply that war between them would become not only unthinkable but impossible. In 1955, West Germany was admitted into NATO. The symbolism was immense. A nation that had once set Europe on fire was now part of its defense. American soldiers remained stationed across German soil, but not as conquerors. They were now protectors, allies, even neighbors. For many Germans, especially those in border towns near the Iron Curtain, the sight of American convoys became a reassurance. The new threat came not from the West, but from the East. The Soviet-backed regime in East Germany, where barbed wire and ideology divided families and futures. In contrast, the Western zones flourished. Freedom, once a foreign import, had become the national identity. Economically, the numbers told the story. By 1957, West Germany's industrial output had surpassed pre-war levels. Cities gleamed with new architecture. Workers earned steady wages, and unemployment plummeted. The phrase Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, entered everyday language, and for good reason. Yet amid the success, the human memory of the Americans endured most vividly. Elderly Germans still spoke of the first GI who handed them a chocolate bar. Mothers remembered the kindness of soldiers who shared rations with hungry children. For a generation traumatized by fear and propaganda, those gestures had carried more power than any speech. In the long arc of history, what had begun as occupation had transformed into alliance, and alliance into friendship. The Americans had done something extraordinary. They had conquered without destroying, ruled without humiliation, and departed without resentment. By the 1960s, when President John F. Kennedy stood before cheering crowds in Berlin and declared, "Ich bin ein Berliner," his words were not mere diplomacy. They were the echo of a promise made 2 decades earlier. The promise that freedom, once brought to a broken land, could take root and flourish even in the soil of former tyranny. Germany's story after 1945 was not just about recovery, it was about moral reinvention. And behind that reinvention stood the image of the American GI, walking through ruined towns, his pockets full of small gifts, and his heart full of something rarer than victory: compassion. That compassion became the true weapon of democracy, silent, enduring, and undefeated. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world expected revenge. What it witnessed instead was redemption. The meeting between the American soldier and the German civilian became one of the quietest turning points in modern history. Not fought with weapons, but with gestures of humanity. A chocolate bar, a smile, a moment of dignity. These were the building blocks of a new Europe. For the Germans, the GIs were living proof that strength did not need cruelty, and that victory could coexist with mercy. For the Americans, the ruins of Germany became a reminder that freedom was not inherited. It was earned, rebuilt, and shared. 2 decades earlier, both nations had represented opposite ends of belief. One worshipped power, the other principle. But, in the aftermath of war, they found a fragile middle ground: the belief that progress was possible without domination, and that justice could exist without hatred. The roads the GIs once marched on became highways of commerce. The barracks turned into schools and research centers. Children who had once feared American tanks grew up learning American science, speaking American English, and embracing democratic ideals as their own. This was the real legacy of the occupation, not the presence of soldiers, but the presence of ideas. It was the story of how one nation, humbled by defeat, learned again to walk upright, guided not by force, but by example. Today, when American and German soldiers stand side by side in peacekeeping missions, they carry more than shared duty. They carry a shared history born from rubble and rebirth. It is a reminder that even in humanity's darkest century, light found its way back, not through grand speeches, but through ordinary people who chose to act with decency when the world had forgotten the word. And so, when the American GIs walked into those German towns in 1945, they did not just end a war. They began something infinitely rarer: a peace that would last.